Willkommen bei Kontext TV.
Welcome to Context TV. The 1990s were marked by a global triumph of capitalism. Today, however, facing financial crises, climate change and a food crisis, more and more people wonder if this economic system is able to resolve the big challenges of our future, or if capitalism is rather part of the problem. Immanuel Wallerstein, professor of sociology at Yale University, Connecticut, has studied extensively the economic system that has spread over the world during the last 500 years. He has developed a world system theory, which was discussed internationally both with recognition and controversy. We talked to Wallerstein at the World Social Forum in Dakar. We are here at the Savannah Hotel in Dakar. With us is Immanuel Wallerstein.
Mr. Wallerstein, you have predicted some years ago that global capitalism will not survive the next 30 years. Explain why you have come to this prediction.
Well, first of all, you start with a couple of assumptions. All systems have lives. No system is eternal. And the reason all systems, and that goes from the universe as an entire system to the smallest subatom system. All systems have lives. And the reason all systems have lives is they all have internal contradictions, and over time they move far from equilibrium. And when they move far enough from equilibrium, they begin to oscillate enormously, and they have what the scientists of complexity call, in this chaotic situation, a bifurcation. And at that point, the system cannot survive, but where it will go is uncertain because there are two alternative possibilities. That's a general premise. Now, if you look at the capitalist system as a particular historical social system, then you see that there are certain phenomena which have led it to the point where it is moved far from equilibrium. Basically, capitalism is a system seeking the endless accumulation of capital. That's its only objective. It continuously attempts to do this. In order to attempt to do this, they have to create enterprises which obtain profit and therefore accumulate capital. If you look at the costs for a capitalist of any enterprise, he has three basic costs. One cost is the cost of personnel, paying the personnel from the top personnel to the bottom personnel. And the second basic cost of a capitalist is paying for the inputs that go into the production of whatever he's producing. And the third basic cost is taxation in all its forms, which is a phenomenon that is standard throughout the system. Now, if you look at the history, this will take a long time to account in detail, but if you look at the history of all three phenomena, the costs of personnel, the costs of inputs, and the cost of taxation, they have been steadily going up for 500 years. And if you at the same time realize that there is a limit to how much you can raise prices, which is the limit of the willingness of people to purchase items, then what you have is an increasing cost level going up for 500 years, reaching what I call asymptotes, at which point, when it gets close enough to the top, the system begins to oscillate, and you get enormous constant shifts in what's going on. That's a chaotic situation, and that's where we are. I've written about this in great detail in various places, but basically the basic argument is that it is no longer possible for capitalists to really accumulate capital. And since that's the whole point of the system, to accumulate capital, the system no longer makes sense from the point of view of capitalists. Of course, it never made sense from the point of view of the populations of the world who were exploited and so forth. That's not new. That's a constant. And it isn't that the populations of the world are more upset than they've always been. They've always been upset. But what has really changed is the degree to which, for capitalists themselves, capitalism is a useful system. So that's the crisis, the structural crisis of the system in which we find ourselves today.
In Europe, we have stagnating labor costs, or stagnating at least incomes, and we have globalization, where the production is going to Romania, to China, to cheaper countries.
Yes,
we have tax cuts for big companies. So it's unusual to hear that all these costs going up for.
Well, but you have to look at it in terms of costs going up and down. The costs always go up and down, right? And if you look at how it's worked over 500 years, all these cost levels, you will see that in periods of expansion, which last about 25 or 30 years, we tend to call them Kondratiev phases, but that the name is unimportant. When in periods of expansion, the costs go up. And in periods of stagnation, the costs go down again. They're pushed down. They're never pushed down as much as they've gone up. So it's what I call a ratchet effect. It goes up 2, but goes down 1. It goes up 2, it goes down 1. And that's been happening for 500 years. If you take simple costs, and this your readers will, or your listeners will understand, if you compare the costs, the price of labor, right, not with 1970, which is a high point, and it's lower today. But if you compare it to 1945, it's higher today. So it went up from 1945 to 70. It went down from 70 to 2010. No question about that. But it didn't go down to the 1945 level. And that's the point. And you can move that back in time and time and time, and you will see, you can trace it very easily on a chart. It constantly goes up 2, goes down 1, and if you start, how shall I say, if you measure it on some kind of scale in which 100% is the maximum, and you start at 20% for, let's say, labor costs, and you move up to 30 and then down to 25, and up to 35 and down to 30, and so on. When you get to 80, you're too close. And that's when the system begins to shake. So basically, there's a limit to how long you can continue this process. We've continued it for 500 years. It's worked very well. Capitalism has been a magnificently successful system in its own terms. It has achieved what it set out to achieve, which was this enormous expansion of accumulated capital. Right? But it can't continue to do that. It's reached the limits of what it can possibly do. And at that point, it loses its interest for the capitalist. If he can't really accumulate capital anymore, then why put in the effort and the energy and so forth? So I think that's the basic situation. Now, I'm saying this as the analyst. If you ask me, does every capitalist in the world realize this? No. Every capitalist in the world does not realize this. Every worker in the world does not realize this. But there are enough who realize it. And the objective reality is such that it forces them to make certain kinds of decisions. These days, basically, as in any long stagnation period, money is not made from production. Money is made from financial speculation, and speculation works, but it only works up to a point. Speculation works by indebting people, and you run through bubbles, and we've had magnificent bubbles since the 70s, one after another, and we're in fact we've just had the next to the last bubble. That was the so-called Great Crisis of 2007, 2008. It's not the last one, because the last one is now going to be the indebtedness of governments, and one after another is going to collapse under its debt, which it cannot figure out any way of paying. That's a reality. So I think capitalism is in great trouble as a system, and the question is what happens. And there I say, well, it bifurcates, and there are two alternatives. One is for those who are privileged in the existing system and would like to maintain their position of privilege, is to find another kind of system that would give them the same privileges, that is, the same kind of a system which would be hierarchical, exploitative, and polarizing. It doesn't have to be a capitalist system. It isn't the only way you can achieve that objective. In fact, it could be a much worse system than capitalism. Capitalism may not be the worst system the world has ever seen. Okay, so that's alternative A. And alternative B is quite the opposite. It's a system that's relatively democratic and relatively egalitarian, a system the world has never seen. And basically, that's our historical choice. And now I have to throw in a last element. What you can say in this kind of situation of bifurcation is it's absolutely inherently impossible to predict which of the choices we will collectively make. And that is because it's the result of an infinity of detailed decision-making by an infinity of persons over an infinity of moments. And it's impossible to predict. You can only predict that the existing system will collapse and one of the choices will be made. So the battle, the political battle of the next 20, 30, 40 years is whether the system will go in one direction or another, will tilt in one way or another. At some point in a chaotic situation of this kind, the system tilts sort of definitively, and then you get a new order, a new kind of system that succeeds and then goes on for whatever its natural life will turn out to be, and somewhere down the line, 500 or 1,000 years later, that system too may be in trouble. But you know, we won't be around to worry about that one. What I can say is that if you come back in the year 2050, we will be living in a different kind of system. I don't know which kind of system. I know which kind of system I prefer that we live in, but I don't know which kind of system we will be living in.
Africa is still the poorest continent in many aspects and marginalized in world trade, for example. Why is that so?
And which role did the debt crisis in the 70s and 80s play?
Well, the debt crisis, of course, was devastating. Debt crisis the debt crisis is step two. Step one, right, is when we have a rise in the price of oil, a very serious rise in the price of oil, which is a way of restructuring the flow of surplus value to oil-producing states. Those states that weren't oil producing, which was most of African states, found that their national income had gone down significantly because they had to pay a lot more, and the items that they sold, given the decline in world production, brought in less income. So the money that was accumulated in the oil-producing states had to be couldn't be spent all. It was put in banks, and banks were largely in Germany and the United States. What these bankers did, you have to have this image. It's quite incredible. The banks sent out representatives to meet with finance ministers across the world, and they're saying, you're having balance of payments difficulties, we'll lend you money. Okay? We'll lend you money. Now, they lent them piles of money. Obviously, the finance ministers were going to accept this money because they otherwise would have had political difficulties in their countries. So that was very simple, except that debts have the nasty habit of wanting to be paid back, especially since they build on themselves. The debt crisis comes when countries have to begin to pay back the debts. The debt crisis it's usually stated that the debt crisis began in Mexico in 1982. This is incorrect. The debt crisis begins in Poland. In 1980, the debt crisis. What is the Polish government? Was a great borrower. Most of the East European states were great borrowers in this period, and not just African states, and not just Latin American states, but the East European states. And what happened was the Polish government at some point couldn't pay the debts. So what did they do? On their own, they decided on the policy which the World Bank would recommend. They decided to squeeze the workers. The squeeze the workers led to solidarity. It's as simple as that. Now the same thing then happens in Mexico in '82, but because people in the West were so incapable of realizing that the East European countries were part of the capitalist world economy and were borrowing money the same way Latin American countries, they simply couldn't understand that was what solidarity was about. It was a workers' rebellion against a state that was trying to squeeze the workers in order to pay back the debts. And it's interesting, people forget, in the 1980s, the International Monetary Fund had a list of good boys and bad boys. And the leading good boy in the world, the best boy, was Romania, because Romania was paying back all its debts. And of course, it's squeezing the people, and of course, you know what happened in Romania. In the end, Ceausescu is thrown out in a most violent way. But so the debt crisis is actually the first of the bubbles that burst in the history of the bubbles that go on from 1970 to our day.
And after the debt crisis, the structural adjustment.
Well, there was structural adjustment, and then, but if you want to look at, you have to look at it as who gets indebted next. So what happens after getting third world countries and Eastern European countries to borrow money which they can't pay back? So that's the first group of debtors. Then the second group of debtors is the junk bonds. And what are junk bonds? Basically, it means that the corporations are borrowing enormous amounts of money which they can't pay back. They liquidate the corporations, and that makes a lot of money for some people, of course. But it destroys those industries or corporations. Then there's another group of indebted people, which is the U.S. government, which begins to be indebted, and then there's the individual debtors all over the world which culminates in this problem of the housing burst, and now we're getting finally the states, which are borrowing money like mad and are finding it impossible, or will be finding it impossible, to pay back their debts. So,
since the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, many are talking about the decline of the USA as a superpower. On the other hand, the US is still spending as much money on its military as all the other states combined.
Yeah, but what can they do with it? You see, look, the U.S. has been declining since 1970. It was a slow decline. George Bush came along and said, I'm going to reverse this by my macho militarism. I'm going to invade Iraq. I'm going to get the Europeans to be terrified of the idea of pulling away from the U.S. I'm going to intimidate Iran, and I'm going to intimidate North Korea, and I'm going to intimidate the Arab states, and it's going to be marvelous. Well, it turned out to be not marvelous at all. It was a catastrophe. It was a blowback in every possible way. The war went on for years and years and years, and ended with a government which is not going to be pro-American at all. It merely increased the authority and power of the Iranians, their presumed great enemies, in Iraq. Didn't intimidate the Europeans. The Iranians and North Koreans drew the lesson from this that they better speed up the process of nuclear armament, not slow it down, and so forth. So from a slow decline, we turn into a precipitate decline. The U.S. has the strongest military in the world. 10 times anybody else. Nobody could attack the U.S. It's absolutely true, and it has all this wonderful machinery. And what can it do with it? See? You can't bomb a country into submission. It's impossible. You have to send in troops. Yeah, we don't have troops. The U.S. does not have troops to send in. They have to. The reason they don't have troops to send in is the American people are all very happy to have military victories. They just don't want to send in their sons to be troops. Right? This is the Vietnam syndrome, but it's a very real thing in the United States. So there's no troops to go in, and so the U.S. can't win in Iraq. They can't win in Afghanistan. They both will eventually pull out of both. And they have this marvelous, strongest army in the world, which is not usable. That's the real point about the army. So you can look at it a different way. The function of the U.S. military at this point is it's a mode of employing people. It's a mode of maintaining a certain degree of expenditure within the United States. It has those internal economic functions, but it does not function as a military machine. It's an unusable military machine, although it is true it is the strongest military in the world, with the best planes, the best bombs, the best everything. No question about that. Though nobody's going to invade the United States. It's also very clear. But so what? Nobody wants to invade the United States. It's a non-issue, right? So, and this is beginning to be recognized within the United States itself, right? The sanctity of military expenditure is being questioned not only on the left but on the right as a financial expenditure, etc. And the old tone of isolationism is rearing its head again as a serious political option within the United States today, and that requires pulling back the troops bit by bit by bit.
In the perspective of a declining capitalism, which role can social movements play with regards to overcome multiple crises?
Well, look, social movements have an enormous role to play. First of all, the bifurcation of which I'm talking about, will be decided by the collective activities of everybody. So it seems to me social movements have to first worry about appropriately analyzing what's really going on, understanding what's happening in the world. That's not easy. It's very difficult, in fact, but that's the way. And then they have to decide, well, then they have to throw their weight on one side or the other of this bifurcation. And then they have to think about what political strategies will push in one direction. Now, none of these are easy things. And that's what we're wrestling with in the World Social Forum. And individual social movements are wrestling with this all over the place. And there's a second problem, and the second problem is one of timing. In the short run, and by short run I mean maximum 3 years, people live in the short run. They eat in the short run. They die in the short run. They're worried about their security in the short run. In the short run, the most we can do in this kind of situation is to minimize the pain. You support this rather than that because that minimizes the pain, and if you took the alternative, it would maximize the pain. Okay? That isn't a transformative thing. Minimizing the pain is a defensive action. Doesn't transform the world, but it's important. People need that. Nobody wants to die tomorrow because there's insecurity in the streets, or because they're cut off from all food or housing or whatever. Okay, so social movements have to worry about this kind of short-run need, but then there's the middle run, and the middle run is in terms of this larger transformation. So social movements have to learn how to combine a short run, minimizing the pains tactic with a middle run strategy of transforming the world.